Brenda's had a 27-year plus experience working in TAFE as a teacher consultant and now has moved out into her own practice. I will probably leave it there because Brenda's got her own little brief introduction as well. And enjoy, please. Welcome, Brenda.
Thank you. So, backed by popular demand, what good is sitting alone in your room? Come hear the music play. Life is a cabaret, old chum. Come to the cabaret. Put down your knitting, your book and your broom. It's time for a holiday. Life is a cabaret, old chum. Come to the cabaret. Oh, I wasn't going to do it this year, but I was coerced by a few people. So this is the way I usually open my presentations when I'm working and explaining things about people on the autism spectrum. For me, coming on and singing is actually my safe place. So it's like a stage for me. For people on the spectrum, you need to find their safe place and where they're comfortable. So today's presentation is quite different to what I usually do. Usually I talk about transitions from school to post-school options, but I've ventured into a new space with a lovely lady, Roz, that I met in Melbourne at a Disability Expo there. And what we found was that we're quite like-minded, and that we found that this issue of resilience and looking at attachment theory has not been addressed, and with the new space of NDIS it's become, well, I'm saying, quite an issue. So firstly, sorry about my little camera, I've got to send it down to Ross so she knows what the presentation's like because she wasn't able to be here. So another song I was going to sing, which we're singing tonight, is the acknowledgement song, but I'm not going to give you all that. So I'll just say we acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and other First Australians who call this place their home. We pay respects to elders past and present and all Indigenous that are here. Now, another little preempt to this presentation, there may be, I just want to give a trigger warning because I may be going to spaces that you're not that comfortable with. So, yeah, let's have a look at it. So, as Tracy wonderfully explained, I was a teacher consultant for 27 years based at Mount Druitt TAFE, which is one of the highest Indigenous disability populations and every other socio-economic thing you want to know. So since my volunteer redundancy in March 2016, I stepped up, very volunteer, I stepped up my private practice, and I now call myself Autism Step Australia, so Autism Spectrum Transition Education Programs. I work as I'm not a registered provider with NDIS because they won't recognise my 5 degrees and half a PhD. So, sorry for a few tongue-in-checks here. What I'm doing is working with plan-managed and self-managed clients and have found a way around the system, working with people and subcontracting. The registration is prohibitive for me. It would cost about $30,000 to go through the audit process, and also then if I become a behaviour specialist, I've got to come under the Safeguards Commission and you've got to report absolutely everything. So I'm not going there. And it's easy to work under different ways of being creative. This presentation, I'm sorry about the confusion with the program, but I was trying to get a catchy title to get you in here. Well, it got you in the door. And this is the presentation that I did in Melbourne at the Australian National Counsellors Association. And it was also a poster presented at the Autism in Education Conference in September this year, and we're hoping the paper will be published in the Australian Journal of Counselling coming up next year. So I need to just explain to start with, because of the audience this was designed for, some of this information will be second nature to you, but I've also learned over the years with audiences that you don't assume. You don't assume knowledge, and you don't assume that people don't know things or do know things, but there's always one new thing you pick up. So I'm just putting that preempt on the start. So there's things that may look at what you already know, but I just want to throw a new idea out to you, some self-reflection. So this is presented, and we looked at this because we're finding that adults that we're working with are articulating that they have developed mental health issues due to interventions they've received over many years. And attachment issues have never been addressed, nor are they given the strategies to develop the resilience for that. So all the interventions that we do might be great, but have you ever thought what they do to people? Right? So we'll get there. I've got to do lots of things here. I've got to go next. Okay? There we go. Okay, so consistency in maintaining the therapist and support worker is important. So overall case management's really great, but then we can look at how that affects the person. Have you ever thought of that client coming into you, the student coming into you? How many times they've had to repeat their story? How many times they've had to explain at school, at high school, to the counsellor, to the psychologist, to the LAC at NDIS? And how many times do they have to repeat their story? And repeating their story, they've got to describe their deficits. Who else looks at their strengths? So you've got to consider where this person can be, and also looking at appropriate relationship building. So the aim is, as I said, is to generate thought and discussion about when too much support is detrimental. So just going over and getting a baseline of everybody, we have our usual sort of autism diagnosis criteria based on the DSM-5. Unfortunately, that's what we're stuck with in Australia at the moment. I found this deficits approach really disturbing, and I'd rather see something that looking at the ICF, which is the International Classification of Functioning Disability and Health. And that way you look at the individual and look at their needs in a variety of environments. Are you also aware of the guidelines for the autism spectrum diagnosis that's been put out by Autism CRC? Yes? No? Okay. So Autism CRC, led by Dr. Andrew Whitehouse, a really fantastic fellow, has, and with a group of people on the autism spectrum, because Autism CRC is totally inclusive, have been challenging the different diagnosis levels across Australia, where you'll find a psychiatrist, psychologist in different states, different criteria for different purposes. You may know there's a different criteria for Centrelink as there is for NDIS. And so they have got together, looked at everything and put a standard together. So the next problem with that is being able to educate psychologists and psychiatrists and the people who are deemed appropriate to tick off the boxes. What I found when I presented this at the Counsellors and Psychologists Conference was that they had little knowledge of autism. It's not something that's built into their training. And a colleague said the other day they've got doing a psychology degree and they're getting that much about autism. So you have people in positions of power for funding that don't know what they're doing. So in saying that, I'm sorry, I've just got to keep referring to my notes because my brain doesn't go too far now. It's critical that the client's needs and that the presence or absence of a diagnostic label are used to determine eligibility and prioritisation of access to intervention and support services. So looking at this current diagnosis is looking at an evaluation of behaviours that can be subjective to that person in the room. I have so many clients come to me and say, we've had trouble getting a diagnosis because the doctor said I've got eye contact. And I don't know if you are aware that a lot of people on the spectrum train themselves to either look at a spot, I mean that's what I teach people, is to look at a spot on your forehead or pretend, or the exhaustion of trying to maintain that eye contact and keep the mask up for that is just really difficult for them. But yeah, doctors will say, oh, they've got eye contact and they've got conversation. Sorry. So you need to look at a holistic approach with any diagnosis, and to be strengths focused and look at a lifetime perspective. So a lot of my colleagues are really good in one situation. So a gentleman who was my student is now my colleague, and he's been running our peer mentoring program. He's really great standing and presenting. But who knows that it takes him 3 days to lead up to that 2-hour session, and it takes him 3 days to go out of it. And to get into the building, we had a problem with the code and the alarm would go off. So he would be in the car under a blanket whilst I try and sort out the code for the building, because the alarm kept going off and he'd have absolute right terror. Then he'd have to pull himself together and stand there and present. So putting people in different situations and during their lifetime, remember the support needs change as each environment changes. Okay, so I keep forgetting I'm not here to give you those analogies. All right. So let's look at homes with families with autism and complex. So by looking at the stats, the evaluation and evaluating the genetic links that research is finding with people on the spectrum, that we may have many parents that are neurodiverse and they have non-standard ways of communicating, implementing parenting skills and relationship development. Thus, the child's learnt behaviours from home may not fit the regular modalities of therapies presented by educators and therapists. So, looking at holistic and the additional stress on the family. And just this genetic link, I was based in Mount Druitt for 27 years. My primary was to see people with intellectual disability and then autism. And in 27 years, I was up to seeing 4th generation. And that's pretty significant. So people that had not gone through to university, had not held a significant job, had been on welfare, and had inherited poor parenting skills and poor communication skills. I'm not being rude, I'm being honest, okay? So there's a lot of people on the autism spectrum and adults that have a struggle with self-determination, with developing and maintaining personal agency and autonomy and resilience. And as I said, parents, teachers and therapists can struggle with identifying people's strengths and abilities. So the complexity of family dynamics plays a huge role in adults on the spectrum making independent choices and decisions that are right for them. So we've got to find how to develop that skill set and how to develop it through either a therapeutic or supportive way. So traditional models of therapy, there we are, traditional models of attachment theory. So that families are complex environments, and this complexity from the family can be transferred into the therapeutic and educational settings. So there can be inappropriate issues or inappropriate ways of communicating and transference of these skills. Attachment theory assumes that people's innate needs for social support and interpersonal connection, and this is shaped throughout life. However, they've found with the research that coming from you don't usually go backwards, you usually go forwards. So if you've got poor skills, you've got something to develop with. You don't often start off with great skills and deteriorate. So you've got to look at all those different types of relationships and how those people interact. The literature review that we conducted has discovered a paucity of research investigating attachment between support carers, personnel, practitioners and their clients with disability. We found basically zero. So nobody's looked at this issue and how to develop somebody's independence by doing it. So, Mr. Dustin Reed. So he looked at attachment orientations, and a third of the individuals experiencing changes in their attachment style. So these theories are proposed by this gentleman, looking at connect attachment and its role in conceptualisation of relationships of people with disabilities and their caretakers. Connect attachment with its role in treatment, and exploring how attachment theory relates to attitudes, perceptions of people concerning people with disabilities. So you need to be aware as a practitioner of what these three things are. And also standard methods that counsellors and psychotherapists and all those people use are often CBT and theories where the person's supposed to project and imagine and put themselves in another situation. And we're talking about people that's probably their greatest weakness, is to think in a different realm, in a different way. So, we have. Pearson's did a research and looked at the relationship between attachment styles and people with behaviour, challenging behaviours and developmental disability. She concluded that there's empirical research that there's a relationship and attachment style that's different. Other researchers discovered that children with learning disabilities reported less secure attachments in close relationships and more anxiety. The evaluation could be that people with disability are subject to many changes in their support systems, so they become insecure about who they trust. And when they do get a consistent support worker, they can develop attachment issues. So there's two lots of thoughts. So with some of the people I'm dealing with, they have consistent support workers. And as Lorraine was saying yesterday, trying to find a commitment of people that will stay and be your support person for an extended period of time, so you develop a healthy relationship but know what each other's needs are, is really hard in this NDIS climate. Even at TAFE, trying to find part-time teachers that will stick with the program was really hard. So you can imagine every time you go to feel comfortable with somebody, that person leaves. So you're getting all this, attachment stuff. If I get too close to the person, I might be doing it in the wrong space. If I get too close to this person, I feel comfortable, they're going to leave. And I know that us that have been in the same job position for so long, you know that those students may come back for their second or third degree, but they know to come back to you and they know that you're there. But if you take leave, they're not going to come and see that person that's replaced you. And I know that's happened since I've left TAFE. So, I'm going to get to something. Is that next? All right, so, and professionals with working with people with disabilities can have their own insecure attachment styles, and they could potentially transfer their own attachment issues to clients. And they also have a prejudice and stigma of disability towards clients. So there can be your general GP or your psychologist who have learnt about mental health, who have learnt about autism, and they have their own prejudice of where they're at and assume certain things. I'm currently starting a project with the Office of Emergency Services, and we spoke in our first meeting about people having a little sticker on their house or on their car about, I have autism, just so that there can be some support. So when emergency services come in, we can train them how to react appropriately to that person. But the whole feeling in the community is no, because police think that autism means that you're going to be violent and you're going to hurt somebody and we're not going to be able to control you. So we're trying to change that. But doctors do it and other people do it because they have met one person on the spectrum. And you meet one person on the spectrum, you've met one person on the spectrum, as my friend Stephen Mark Shaw tells you. So, I have a little exercise for you. Now this is a bit to the bone, and I learned about this last year through Professor Wallace, that 80% of the people in the room have ACE issues. And your ACEs are your adverse childhood experiences. So I'm going to not read this out. It's on a couple of slides. I'm just going to go fairly slowly and for you to have a look at how many ticks you get. You don't have to disclose to anyone, we're not going to disclose it, but just have a read. Next one. Next. Next. It's the last one. So this is pretty confronting. And as Professor Wallace found, that just sitting in the room that I was in with 80 people, 80% of those people had ACE scores higher than 3. So we're often in this profession because we've lived through trauma, we've had adverse childhood experiences, so we know how that feels and we want to be able to help and work with people. So it's really hard. We've got a whole cohort now of creating a professional cohort of people who may have attachment issues themselves that haven't dealt with their own, and they project these onto their clients. And also I said professional anxiousness attachment style is directly associated with therapeutic relationship. So the WHO's also looked at the stigma associated with mental health breeds prejudice among other healthcare professionals. So in saying that, the impact that I'm seeing at the moment, and that impact is coming towards with the NDIS. So just this is my observation and what I'm seeing, so they're my personal opinions. The NDIS has created an industry of casualised and often unskilled and low experienced support workers. So even though us in the TAFE system, 25 years ago developed what's now called the Individual Support Course, the Cert 3 in Disabilities, and the Teachers Aid course and the Cert 4 in vocational education and training and a whole lot of other things. We had somebody who had the foresight to know that we're going to need trained support workers, and why shouldn't our most vulnerable people in the community have the best experienced people and skilled people to work with them. And we pushed for many years to try and get that as a minimum qualification, as a Cert 3, a minimum qualification for people to work in group homes and in the employment sector. That hasn't translated too well, and it's still not translating too well. So there are some really good organisations around that are now implementing in-house training in relation to knowing your boundaries as a support worker with your clients. Some have minimal qualifications. There are some online, online systems where support workers and the clients can match up, and all that's required to list on there is to have a working with children's check, police check, and a first aid certificate. And so you're leaving the hiring to the client's family. I'd like to refer back to Lorraine yesterday, who is very good at what she's doing. She's well educated, she's well skilled, she's resourceful, she has computer literacy, she has great advocacy skills, and she knows the system. And Cameron's given the opportunity to interview his own support workers. She's one of few. And I think you should recognise and applaud the wonderful parent she's been. Most of the parents that I'm seeing may be well educated in their own sphere, but they've always had somebody else to find a support worker, somebody else to provide the support through the Teachers Aid or whatever. I need to fasten up a bit. Okay, so often parents don't have the skills to evaluate or match the functional needs of the person and the skills and the experience they need from the professional that they're having. This can have negative impacts. The ability of and the objectivity to select support workers may have limitations. So people need to look at what's reasonable and necessary, then the participants to have choice and control. So there are a lot of support people and organisations in NDIS that are taking advantage of funding and requesting bookings being weekly, fortnightly, and that, you know, people are demanding to see your plan, and then they're putting a service agreement in the system and locking funds for extraordinary amounts of money when they're not providing the service. Personally, how I work is I do a service agreement for one appointment, and if we like each other and we think we can work well, we continue, and I see people once a month. I do not over-support. By over-supporting, you're actually reinforcing the weaknesses and insecurity of the client, that they're continuing seeing that there's something wrong with them and they need to have somebody with them. So you need to have people that can provide the resilient skills and the opportunities to let that person be independent. Okay, the quick bits. So, therapeutic supports need to have strategies towards independence. That should always be your goal. You need to fade support and look at appropriate ethics of which people are working under. So the goal is to create the client, so your client, your student, whatever you want to call the person you're working with, to create healthy relationships and that promote self-determination, empowerment and independence. And just look at what that person's probably gone through before. So we look at strength-based work, so this is all the counselling type things. So looking at the attributes of the family, looking at life decisions, and also look at the person's strengths that on the autism spectrum, that their hobbies may not be their hobbies, they may actually be a very important skill set that they can use for future vocational and career advancement. So have a look outside the square. Okay, things you may know already. Strength-based approach, looking at individual strengths, looking at the whole fan of their life, So overall health, sexuality, spirituality, and looking at environmental strengths and what you can use in the natural environment.